Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
The building I lived at only had 3 units, and my landlord lived in the biggest apartment upstairs. When I first moved in 6 months ago, he seemed nice enough. Middle-aged guy who worked from home doing something with computers. The rent was reasonable, the location was perfect for my commute, and I found a decent place to start my adult life. It started with small things. The hallway light bulb burned out and stayed that way for weeks. The mailbox lock was loose and kept jamming. But I could live with those minor inconveniences. What I couldn't live with was my kitchen sink deciding to turn into a waterfall. It began when a small drip about 3 months into my lease. I figured I'd mention it to my landlord the next time I saw him. But the drip quickly became a steady stream, and soon I was dealing with a full-blown leak that required me to keep a large bucket underneath the pipes. Every morning I'd wake up to a bucket half full of water that I'd have to dump before getting ready for work. Every evening I'd come home to the same situation. I sent my first text message about the leak on a Tuesday morning, explaining that the kitchen sink was leaking pretty badly underneath and asking if he could take a look when he had a chance. No response for 3 days. So I tried again, following up about the sink leak and mentioning that it was getting worse and I was having to empty a bucket twice a day now. This time he responded with a dismissive message saying he saw my text and would get to it soon, but that it wasn't urgent. Not urgent? I was literally living with a bucket permanently stationed under my sink, but okay. I gave him another week before sending an email with photos of the growing water damage to the cabinet floor. The email went ignored completely. 2 weeks later, I caught him in the hallway and brought it up in person. I asked if he had gotten my email about the sink and explained that the leak was really bad now. He brushed me off again, saying he'd get to it soon and that it wasn't like it was an emergency or anything. I tried to explain that it was causing water damage to the cabinet and that I was worried about mold. His response was dismissive. He told me he had a lot on his plate and that it was just a little water. Since I had a bucket, he considered the problem solved. I stood there speechless when he walked away. A little water? I was emptying nearly 2 gallons a day at this point. But here's where the story gets interesting. See, my landlord had this habit of never being home during normal business hours, and apparently he ordered a lot of stuff online. Like, a lot. Almost daily delivery drivers would ring my doorbell because he wasn't available to sign for packages. At first, I didn't mind helping out. I'd accept the packages and leave them neatly in the hallway outside his door. Sometimes it was just regular mail or small boxes, but other times it was expensive-looking equipment, large boxes that clearly contained electronics, and once even what appeared to be a new laptop based on the box. I never asked him to compensate me for this service. I never even mentioned it. I just figured it was the neighborly thing to do. Plus, I worked from home 2 days a week, so I was usually around when the deliveries came. But when my sink situation got more desperate and his responses got more dismissive, I started to feel taken advantage of. Here I was, going out of my way to help this guy with his packages, while he couldn't be bothered to fix a basic maintenance issue in the apartment I was paying him rent for. The final straw came on a Friday afternoon. I'd sent yet another message about the sink, this time mentioning that the leak had gotten so bad that I was considering calling a plumber myself and deducting it from my rent. His response was rude. He told me not to threaten him about the rent and insisted the sink wasn't urgent, ending with a harsh instruction to just deal with it. Deal with it? I've been dealing with it for months, while also dealing with his package situation. That's when it hit me. I've been solving his problem without him even asking, while he couldn't be bothered to solve mine despite repeated requests. The next Monday, I made a decision. When the doorbell rang at 10 a.m., I looked through the peephole and saw a delivery driver holding a large box. I didn't answer. Tuesday, same thing. Wednesday brought 2 different deliveries. I ignored them all. By Friday, there were 3 missed delivery slips stuck to the front door of the building. The following week brought more of the same. I could hear my landlord upstairs getting frustrated, making phone calls about missing packages. On Wednesday of the second week, he knocked on my door and asked if I'd seen any delivery drivers lately, mentioning that he'd had several packages go missing. I told him I wouldn't know because I've been pretty busy lately. He seemed confused and reminded me that I worked from home sometimes and usually helped with his deliveries. I pretended not to remember agreeing to any such arrangement. He looked confused and annoyed. Then he asked if I could start accepting them again, explaining that some of the stuff was expensive. I told him I didn't know if I could help because that sounded like extra work for me. Then I asked him if it was urgent, using his own words against him. I saw the realization dawn on his face, but he just said something and walked away. The missed deliveries continued. By the end of that week, I could hear him on the phone with various companies trying to reschedule deliveries and track down packages that had been returned to sender. His frustration was obvious. Finally, the following Monday morning, he knocked on my door again. This time, he looked defeated. He acknowledged that he knew I was upset about the sink and mentioned that some important packages had been returned, adding that he really needed my help with deliveries. I brought up the sink issue, mentioning that it had been quite the problem and that I'd actually been thinking about calling the health department about potential mold growth. When he asked about the health department, I explained that the sink had been leaking for months and surely that created some kind of health hazard. I also mentioned that I had documented all my requests for repairs that had been ignored. He was quiet for a moment before asking what would happen if he got the sink fixed that week. I reminded him that he had previously said it wasn't urgent. He quickly promised to call a plumber that very day. I told him that would be great and that I'd really been struggling with this issue. When he asked if I'd be willing to help with packages again, I pretended to think about it. I explained that if my living situation improved, I might be more inclined to help out my neighbors. But then I delivered the perfect comeback, telling him that since my sink leak wasn't urgent, I had figured his deliveries probably weren't either. The next day, a plumber showed up. By Wednesday, I had a fully functional sink with no leaks. The water damage to the cabinet was cleaned up and everything was back to normal. 10 years ago, I was in a relationship with my ex. We had our daughter together, and everything seemed fine until she was just a few weeks old. That's when he decided he was done being a dad and moved out to live with some other woman. For years, he barely acknowledged his daughter existed. No birthday calls, no Christmas visits, nothing. I raised her completely on my own, working 2 jobs, just to make ends meet while he was off playing house with his new girlfriend. I never kept my daughter from him. I could have easily made his life difficult, but I didn't want my kid to grow up thinking I was the reason her dad wasn't around. If he wanted to see her, all he had to do was call. But he rarely did. I wasn't about to chase him around begging him to be a father. A few years ago, I finally got tired of struggling financially and put him on child support. You would have thought I was asking for his kidney was how he reacted. He acted like paying $300 a month made him father of the year. $300. That barely covers her school supplies, let alone everything else she needs. Last year, he married his girlfriend, who I'll call Karen. Suddenly, after 10 years of being absent, he wants more custody. I wasn't going to just hand over my daughter to people she barely knows, so I talked to her therapist first. We agreed to every other weekend as a trial run. I figured if he was serious about being a dad, this would be his chance to prove it. The first weekend she came back, she was miserable. She told me about how dirty their house was, how Karen's kids were mean to her, and how no one paid attention to her. But I encouraged her to give it another chance. Maybe it was just nerves, I thought. But it got worse. Their house is chaos. Karen has 3 kids still at home, a 17-year-old, a 12-year-old, and one my daughter's age. These kids have no supervision, no rules, nothing. They're on their phones all day, they're rude, and they treat my daughter like an outsider. Karen doesn't believe in vaccines either, which means my daughter can't even feel safe health-wise over there. Last weekend was the final straw. My daughter plays soccer, and they were supposed to have her at the game by 12 p.m. By 12:30 p.m., I'm getting frantic texts from her saying they're still not ready to leave. When I called my ex to see what was going on, he started yelling at me about why I was bothering him. I tried to explain that our daughter's soccer game had already started and she was upset about being late. He brushed it off like it wasn't important and said they'd get there when they got there. When I pointed out how much this meant to her, he told me to stop being dramatic and said she could miss one game. They finally showed up 45 minutes late and my daughter was in tears. The game was almost over by then, but the entitled demands didn't stop there. Last week, my ex called me with his most ridiculous request yet. He started complaining about the driving situation and how Karen thought it was unfair that they had to do all the driving since they lived 30 minutes away. He said gas was getting expensive and demanded that we either meet halfway or alternate pickup and drop off duties. I told him that he chose to move out there and that I had told him from the beginning I wasn't changing my life to accommodate him. But he insisted things were different now and kept pushing for me to compromise. Then he dropped the bomb that made me realize just how entitled he really was. He told me they wanted to transfer our daughter to the public school near them. My daughter had worked hard to get into the competitive magnet school in our district. It wasn't easy, and she earned her spot on her own merit. When I asked if he was insane, he explained that Karen's kids were jealous of all the opportunities our daughter got at her school and that it wasn't fair to them. He wanted to take away her opportunities just because his stepkids were jealous. He went on about how she could get a good education anywhere and that the other kids felt left out when she talked about her school projects. Then he had the nerve to say that since he was planning to adopt Karen's kids soon, he needed to think about what was best for the whole family. That's when I lost it. I told him that she had been his daughter for 10 years, and he was just now deciding she mattered, but only if it didn't make his new kids uncomfortable. He got defensive and started talking about his rights as her father. I told him that these were rights he had ignored for almost a decade and only cared about now because his wife was pushing him to play happy family. He threatened to take me to court, so I told him to go ahead and explain to a judge why he thought his daughter should give up her elite education because his stepkids were jealous. He hung up on me after that, but Karen wasn't done. She actually had the nerve to call me herself the next day. She accused me of being selfish about the school situation. When I asked her what she meant, she went on about how her kids had been through a lot and it wasn't fair that my daughter got special treatment just because she was my daughter. I told her that my daughter was also her husband's daughter and that she wasn't getting special treatment. She had earned her spot at that school. Karen then said that if I really cared about what was best for my daughter, I'd want her to be part of their family dynamic. I asked her if she meant the family dynamic where kids raise themselves and no one shows up to soccer games on time. She got offended and told me I had no right to judge their household. I told her I had every right when it affected my daughter. Then she said my daughter needed to learn she wasn't the center of the universe and that her kids were just as important. I suggested that maybe her husband should have thought about that before he abandoned his daughter for 10 years. She hung up too. The whole situation came to a head this past weekend when I went to pick up my daughter. She came out of their house crying, and when I asked what happened, she said Karen had told her she was spoiled and needed to learn to share attention. When I knocked on their door to confront them, Karen answered with this smug smile. She commented that I was early, and I told her we needed to talk about what she had said to my daughter. She just shrugged and said she had told her the truth, that my daughter needed to understand she wasn't special just because she went to some fancy school. My ex appeared behind her and I could tell he was uncomfortable but too weak to stand up to his wife. I told them both that this arrangement wasn't working and that until they could treat my daughter with basic respect, these visits were done. My ex tried to argue that he had rights, but I told him that these were rights he never exercised until now, rights he only cared about because his wife was pushing him. I told him that if he wanted to see his daughter, he needed to prove he actually cared about her well-being instead of just trying to make his new family happy. That's when Karen really showed her true colors. She stepped forward and started ranting about how I was being unreasonable and that I was just trying to keep their family from being whole. She accused me of being jealous of their happiness and said I was using my daughter as a weapon against them. I laughed at that point. I told her that for 10 years I had been the only parent my daughter had, and I wasn't about to let her be treated like a second-class citizen in their house just so Karen's kids wouldn't feel jealous. My ex finally spoke up and said they would take me to court for custody. I told him to bring it on. I had 10 years of documentation showing that I was the primary parent, that I never kept our daughter from him, and that he had chosen to be absent. I also had my daughter's therapist who could testify about the negative impact these visits were having on her. When I was walking back to my car with my daughter, my ex came running after me. He started begging me not to cut off the visits and promised they would do better. Karen was screaming at him from the doorway, telling him not to chase after me. He looked completely torn between his wife and his daughter. I told him that if he wanted to be a real father, he needed to start putting his daughter's needs first instead of worrying about keeping his wife happy. I said that meant respecting her school choice, showing up on time for her activities, and treating her like she mattered as much as his stepkids. 3 days later, he called me back. His voice was quiet, almost defeated. He said that Karen had given him an ultimatum. Either he stopped catering to me and our daughter, or she would leave him. He asked if we could work something out because he didn't want to lose his marriage. Even when faced with choosing between his wife and his daughter, he was still trying to find a way to avoid making that choice. I told him that his daughter deserved better than being someone's second choice, and if he couldn't see that, then maybe it was better if he stayed away. Karen's been pressuring him to legally adopt her kids, but he's been hesitant because it would mean taking on even more financial responsibility. Funny how he was so eager to play dad to her kids, but couldn't be bothered to actually parent his own daughter. Working as an emergency room doctor for 12 years, I've seen heart attacks, overdoses, car accidents, you name it. But nothing prepared me for what happened 3 months ago with a patient I'll call Karen. It started on a normal night during my shift. The paramedics rushed in a woman in her 30s who was having a severe allergic reaction to peanuts. She was in anaphylactic shock, her airways were closing up, and her blood pressure was dropping fast. It was touch and go for a while, but we managed to stabilize her with epinephrine and steroids. By the time she was conscious and breathing normally, it was around 3 a.m. When she woke up, I was doing my final check on her vitals. Her eyes opened and she looked right at me. She told me I had saved her life. I explained that I was just doing my job and asked how she was feeling. She said she felt like she owed me everything and asked for my name. I told her my first name, which was probably my first mistake. She kept thanking me over and over, which seemed normal enough at the time. Grateful patients aren't uncommon in the emergency room. I discharged her the next morning with strict instructions about avoiding peanuts and carrying an EpiPen. 2 days later, she showed up at the hospital with flowers and a box of chocolates. The receptionist called me down, and there she was in the lobby, dressed up like she was going on a date. She said she brought me gifts to thank me properly. I explained that I couldn't accept gifts from patients because it was against hospital policy. Then she insisted on taking me to dinner. I told her I appreciated the gesture, but that I was married with 2 kids and didn't go to dinner with patients. She looked shocked, like the idea that I might be married had never crossed her mind. She said she didn't see a ring on my finger. I explained that I don't wear it during surgeries and said I really needed to get back to work. Being direct only made things worse. Over the next 2 weeks, she started showing up at the hospital almost daily. Sometimes she'd fake symptoms to get seen in the emergency room. Other times she'd just hang around the lobby or the parking garage. Security started recognizing her. The conversations got stranger each time. She told me she'd been thinking about what I said about being married. When I asked what about it, she said she thought I was just saying that to let me down easy. She said it was okay and that she understood I had to be professional at work. I told her I wasn't lying and that I really was married. I showed her a picture of my family on my phone. She claimed that could be anyone and asked why I wouldn't just admit that I liked her too. I said I didn't like her that way and that she needed to stop coming to the hospital. She insisted that I had saved her life, and that had to mean something. She said people don't just save someone's life for no reason. I explained that it meant I was doing my job and nothing more, but she wouldn't listen to reason. She started calling the hospital asking for me specifically. She'd leave gifts at the reception desk addressed to me. She even somehow found out my schedule and would time her visits for when I was getting off work. The breaking point came last week. I was leaving the hospital after a long shift around 11 p.m. One of our nurses was walking out at the same time. She's someone I've worked with for years, a former Taekwondo champion who's tough as nails and doesn't take garbage from anyone. When we walked toward the parking garage, Karen appeared out of nowhere. She said she'd been waiting for hours. I told her she needed to stop this behavior and reminded her that I told her repeatedly that I was married and not interested. She accused me of lying and claimed she knew I felt the same way she did. The nurse stepped forward and told Karen she needed to leave because she was harassing me. Karen spun around and looked at her. She asked who the nurse thought she was and accused her of being just some nurse trying to steal her man. The nurse explained that I wasn't Karen's man, that I was a married doctor trying to do my job, and that Karen was stalking me. Karen told her to stay out of it and called her a homewrecker. Before any of us could react, Karen swung her purse at the nurse's head. Big mistake. The nurse ducked smoothly, grabbed Karen's arm, and used her own momentum against her. In one fluid motion, she flipped Karen over her shoulder. Karen hit the asphalt face first with a loud thud. The nurse said that's what happens when you mess with people. Karen was lying on the ground, dazed and with a scrape on her cheek, making weird groaning sounds. I called security while the nurse called the police. Even though Karen had just attacked her, the nurse still knelt down to check if she was seriously hurt. That's the kind of person she is. The cops arrived within 10 minutes. They took statements from all of us and reviewed the security footage. Karen kept insisting that the nurse had attacked her unprovoked and that I was her boyfriend who was being kept from her against my will. The police officer told her they had video of her swinging first and that I had made multiple complaints about her harassment. Karen protested that I had saved her life and that meant I loved her. The officer explained that saving her life meant I was doing my job and nothing more. They arrested Karen for assault and harassment. The hospital also issued her a restraining order banning her from the property. Her scrape needed a small bandage, but mostly she was just shocked that someone had actually stood up to her. The nurse got a commendation from hospital administration for protecting a colleague. Karen got processed through the legal system and hopefully learned that being grateful to someone doesn't give you the right to stalk them. This happened about 40 years ago when I was a bag boy at a local supermarket. I was 18, fresh out of high school, and trying to save up some money before starting community college. I need to tell you about this co-worker of mine. I honestly can't even remember his name anymore. He was around my age, maybe 19, and he was also a bag boy, but this guy thought he was so much better than everyone else just because his dad was some big shot manager at a local bank. From day one, this guy made my life miserable. He would constantly try to show me up in front of our supervisor, making comments about how I wasn't fast enough or how I wasn't doing things the right way. He would tell anyone who would listen that his father had taught him proper work ethics and that some people just weren't raised right. He treated customers differently based on how they looked. If someone drove up in a nice car or wore expensive clothes, he'd practically kiss their feet. But if an elderly person needed help loading groceries or someone looked like they were struggling financially, he'd suddenly become too busy or find excuses to avoid helping them. He'd make me handle all the difficult customers while he cherry-picked the easy ones. He also had this annoying habit of bragging about his family's money and connections. During our lunch breaks, he'd go on and on about their fancy vacations, their new cars, and how his dad was going to get him a cushy office job at the bank as soon as he turned 21. He'd make snide comments about how the rest of us would probably be stuck in retail forever. But here's the thing that really got under my skin. He was a complete hypocrite about following rules. He'd report other employees for tiny infractions like being 2 minutes late from break, but he'd regularly take extra long lunches and disappear when there was actual work to do. When our manager wasn't around, he'd slack off and leave me to handle twice the workload. One day, I overheard him talking to another co-worker about his family. His parents were extremely strict about certain things. His dad was some kind of health nut who was absolutely against smoking, drinking, or any kind of vice. According to my co-worker, His father had threatened to cut off his college fund if he ever caught him doing anything like that. The guy seemed proud of this, like it made him morally superior to everyone else. This information just sat in the back of my mind for weeks. Then came payday. I had just picked up my weekly paycheck and decided to treat myself to a couple packs of cigarettes from the store. Yeah, I was a smoker back then. Not proud of it now, but that's how it was. I had worked a full week dealing with this guy's attitude, and I figured I deserved a small reward. When I was walking toward the exit, I spotted my co-worker standing in the checkout line, but he wasn't alone. His father was with him. I recognized the man from the few times he'd come to pick up his son. Tall, serious-looking guy in an expensive suit, the kind of person who clearly thought very highly of himself. That's when the idea hit me. A perfectly evil, spur-of-the-moment idea. I walked over to where they were standing and tapped my co-worker on the shoulder. He turned around with that usual smirk on his face. I held out one of the packs I'd just bought, making sure his father could see it clearly, and told him that this was the pack of cigarettes I owed him. My co-worker went completely white. His eyes went wide and I could practically see the panic setting in. He started protesting loudly that he had no idea what I was talking about and that he didn't smoke. I kept insisting that he had asked me to pick these up for him last week. He kept denying it frantically, saying he had never asked me for cigarettes and that he didn't smoke. But the damage was already done. His father's expression had shifted from mild interest to complete fury. The man's jaw was clenched. His father demanded to know if it was true and whether his son was smoking behind their backs. My co-worker kept swearing that he had never smoked in his life and that I was lying. I acted like I suddenly realized my mistake and apologized, saying I must have mixed him up with someone else. I put the cigarettes back in my pocket and started to walk away, but not before catching the look of absolute terror on my co-worker's face. His father was already starting what looked like it was going to be a very unpleasant conversation. The father announced they were going home immediately because they needed to have a serious talk about honesty and trust. My co-worker kept protesting that he was telling the truth and that I was just trying to cause trouble, but his father clearly wasn't buying any of it. When I walked out of the store, I could hear them arguing behind me. My co-worker kept protesting his innocence, but his father clearly wasn't believing a word of it. The guy who had spent months looking down on everyone else was finally getting a taste of his own medicine. The next week at work was absolutely beautiful. My co-worker was completely deflated. His father had grounded him for a month and was making him prove his trustworthiness before he'd consider helping with college expenses. The guy barely spoke to anyone and definitely stopped his constant bragging and superior attitude. He quit about 2 weeks later, claiming he found a better opportunity elsewhere. But word around the store was that his father had cut off his allowance and he needed to find a job that paid more than what he could make as a bag boy. Was it a mean thing to do? Probably. Do I regret it? Not even a little bit. My family came to this country when I was 12, and we had to start from scratch. My parents worked 2 jobs each just to keep us afloat, and watching them struggle taught me to save every penny I could. By the time I was 25, I had managed to build up a decent emergency fund working as a software developer. For some reason I still can't explain, I decided to trust a tiny local credit union with about $15,000 of my savings. Maybe it was their friendly, small-town marketing or the fact that they offered slightly better interest rates than the big banks. Either way, it turned out to be one of the worst financial decisions I've ever made. Everything was fine for the first few months until my debit card randomly stopped working at their ATM one Tuesday morning. I needed cash for a farmer's market that only accepted cash payments, so I walked into their single branch location. The clerk behind the counter looked about 19 and seemed annoyed that I was interrupting her phone conversation. I explained that my card wasn't working at their ATM and asked if she could help me withdraw some cash. She sighed heavily and told me she could give me a temporary code that would let me withdraw directly from my account balance. I had to enter this 6-digit number instead of my PIN. She scribbled some numbers on a sticky note and slid it across the counter without even looking at me. When I asked if this was normal procedure, she said they did this all the time when the card readers acted up and that it was a feature their system had. She went right back to her personal call before I even left the building, but I used the code, got my cash, and forgot about it. 3 days later, I tried to buy groceries and my card was declined. I checked my account balance online and saw that all my funds were locked with a notice about pending review due to accounting irregularities. I called their customer service line immediately. The support representative looked up my account and explained that there was some kind of delay in their system processing a recent transaction, which triggered their fraud protection protocols. When I told them I hadn't done anything fraudulent and that their clerk gave me a code to use at the ATM, there was a long pause before they said these reviews could take several weeks to complete, and they needed to verify all recent account activity. Several weeks? This was my emergency fund, and I needed access to my money. The representative just said they understood my frustration, but bank security was their top priority. The next week, I called again. This time, I got a different person who was even less helpful. When I explained that it had been over a week since my account was frozen and asked about the status, they spoke to me slowly like I was stupid and said these things take time, especially when there are complications with certain types of accounts. I asked what they meant by certain types of accounts. The representative said that with names like mine, they had to be extra careful about compliance and verification procedures. My last name ends in Dashovich because my grandfather was from Eastern Europe. I felt my blood pressure rising. I asked if they were seriously suggesting that my ethnicity had something to do with this. They claimed they weren't suggesting anything and were just explaining why these reviews sometimes take longer than usual. After a month of similar conversations, I was desperate. I had bills to pay and was surviving on credit cards. When I called my parents to vent about the situation, my teenage cousin was visiting and overheard everything. My cousin said she had an idea about these Russian websites where you can pay people to post whatever you want on social media for just a few cents per post. I told her that sounded sketchy, but she insisted it was totally legal and that companies use it for marketing all the time. She said I just needed to be creative about it. She showed me this website that offered social media posting services. For about $3, you could have hundreds of different accounts post customized messages across various platforms. They even let you choose whether you wanted the profiles to look American or international. I spent an hour crafting the perfect complaint message with some help from an AI writing tool. It warned people about First Valley Credit Union, explaining how they froze my account for over a month due to their own system error and how their customer service kept giving me the runaround. It mentioned how the staff made inappropriate comments about my foreign-sounding name and treated me like a criminal for using a temporary code their own clerk gave me. It ended by telling people to avoid this place at all costs. Within 6 hours of paying my $3, the credit union's Facebook page, Twitter account, and Google reviews were absolutely flooded with variations of this complaint. Hundreds of posts from different accounts, all telling slightly different versions of my story. Some mentioned the ethnic discrimination, others focused on the month-long account freeze, and a few even mentioned similar experiences with temporary ATM codes. Watching their social media presence get absolutely demolished was satisfying in a way I didn't expect. The next morning, my phone rang at 8 a.m. sharp. The call center manager from First Valley Credit Union introduced himself and said he was calling about my account situation. I asked if now they were suddenly interested in helping me. He said he wanted to personally apologize for any inconvenience I experienced, and that after reviewing my case, they could see this was entirely due to an internal processing error on their end. I told him it had been over a month and was a little late for apologies. He agreed I was right and said that's why he was prepared to make it right immediately. He offered to transfer my full account balance to any bank of my choosing that same day, plus $50 compensation for the inconvenience. I tried not to sound too eager when I said that would work. He promised to personally handle the transfer that afternoon, and again sincerely apologized for any unprofessional treatment I may have received from their staff. By 5 p.m. that day, every penny of my money, plus the $50 bonus, was sitting safely in my new account at a proper bank. They clearly couldn't figure out how to connect the social media storm back to me. The manager's tone suggested they just wanted to make the problem disappear as quietly as possible. The only downside is that I can't exactly call up my Russian bot army and tell them to stop posting. Those complaints are probably still multiplying across their social media accounts, and honestly, that's their problem now. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.